probably has a full-time CFO, they have hygiene. And then above that, it's interesting as well, because then you get into these, it's often a clean company, but it's so large and it touches so many parts of our company that I have to correlate many connection points, and it's not a single clean one thing. It's 10 things or 20 things where it connects with the company. You have to coordinate that level of complexity. But I found that I think the thing that dictates whether it's hard or whether it's easy is if there's a very clear value proposition. Why do this? I get that. Ooh, that's why we want to do it. And there's a very clear decision maker. And whether that's the owner, the private equity firm, whoever, but there's someone you can interact with that is capable of making the decision. Often when you have to deal with...
On the sell side, you mean?
On the sell side, yes. If there's someone I can talk to that we can make a quick, clean decision, that's very helpful if you're dealing with a wide variety of stakeholders, and you got to squeeze out different entities, and you got to do these other things. Those again become more complicated.
Okay, so let's now look at kind of the funnel and the process, and starting with the very beginning. So we have VCs, in VC you often hear you're just as good as your deal flow, and I guess for corporate development it's kind of the same. So where do you get your deal flow from? What do you do to generate it? And I think it's particularly difficult for smaller companies that are maybe not like the first thought or top of mind of some startups. So maybe starting with Logitech actually on that.
Yeah, I think the deal flow is important. I do feel we actually have a pretty good deal flow. We have relationships with companies like you, and obviously we have our own efforts internal, and a lot of our inbounds come from our business groups. I would say the challenge though for us is sometimes the deal flow doesn't fit what you're actually trying to solve for. So because we are not a big company, we actually have pretty well-defined, like what we would call white spaces, things that we know we would augment for our business groups, and there are just spaces that you wouldn't go into. So, you get a lot of deal flow for categories that generally consumer products, but not categories that are relevant to us. So I think for us, and maybe that's where I feel like the strategy and corporate development makes sense, because our team actually is very familiar with each business group strategies. We know all of the adjacencies that they would be interested in pursuing and adjacencies that they would not be interested in pursuing. So for us, it helps sift fairly quickly through what makes sense, what does not make sense from a BG perspective. And then there are areas where we've identified at the corporate level that are kind of white spaces that we would be interested to go in and develop outside of business groups, that kind of
new businesses.
We have exactly new businesses, and where we have a set of type of targets that we would be looking for. So I think because we have that framework, it helps us to fairly quickly to look at the deal flow and say what makes sense, what doesn't.
And your deal flow itself comes from a mix of, so you say, like generated by the business units themselves that say, oh, this is interesting to us. Probably you come across companies like with your VC network, but are there other sources? Because for startups, one of the challenges is also how to get on the radar of potential buyers. So what are the typical, what are the sources you work with?
I mean, it actually, it varies. I mean, sometimes you get an inbound from a bank who is marketing a business, and you're like, oh, I actually wasn't aware of that the company has this kind of financial profile and kind of fits in our space, so it's interesting. And there are times where we've had like Blue Microphones. I've had it on my, actually knew the partner at Riverside from my previous work. I've been in touch with him for 2 years. And so when we initially contacted, he said, well, look, we're not ready to sell. So it's just been more of a relationship effort over the last 2 years. And when they were ready to divest, we participated in the process. So I think, and we probably have a pretty good list of companies that we monitor that have been on our list for 3 years. And if they're ready to sell, we'd be interested to take a look. But sometimes things just come up. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of a mix.
I'm just trying to understand the mix between maybe VC relationships, bankers. So you mentioned a few, the business units themselves, some inbound from startups, but particularly for the smaller deals, they're not necessarily very visible. So how do you, if you look at the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 deals, if you could tell us where they came from.
I mean, I'll take Rebels as a good example. We acquired a company, Rebels,
so
that was
in your,
it was one of your portfolio companies. we in the earbud business, we've had custom earbud business for a long time. So and there's been multiple companies on Kickstarter in the VC community that have been trying to bring it to scale, right? To bring the custom earbud to kind of retail mass market experience. So we've seen a number of different companies in that space, and so Rebels was the one company that seemed to have a solution that we believe could actually scale. And so I think I guess we have a good understanding at least of problems that we're trying to solve, and then who is actually solving it, it becomes more of a inflow, and that's where your deal flow is important because, again, like you don't actually know all the participants who are working on the problem. I don't know if that helps. And I think for a lot of the technology ingredient acquisitions, that's, I'll bring up example, we talk very openly about our esports and gaming business. So we've been looking at a lot of companies in the streaming and broadcasting space, for example. And again, it spans from companies that are large, spans from the companies that are like a 5-person startups, and then there are people who try to solve it through hardware, people who try to solve it through software. And that's where I would say, we don't have 100% visibility of everyone who's out there, but at least we know the problem we're trying to solve, and then, hopefully the deal flow will help us identify the right players. So, yeah.
How about IBM? Because you guys have lots of businesses, you probably have bankers calling you every day, marketing deals, probably a lot of startups you're already partnering with that might be also potential targets. There's probably lots and lots of sources.
It's several thousand, I think, now inbounds into the company every year.
And sounds like a VC deal flow.
and I would argue, I think most of our deals actually don't come from that. It's I see that deal flow coming in, and it often informs me of what's happening. It's usually a retrospective look, though. It's what's for sale versus I'm usually interested in what's not for sale, which is a growing, interesting, more kind of where we're wanting to go. And so we get it from many different places, and it really depends on the business. So for instance, I'm out here this week, I'm based out of New York, and I'm out here this week in San Francisco. Over the last 2 days, I've met with, 10, 12 VCs that work in the kind of Series A and pre-seed, C to A kind of range. And that represents one of the activities, and that's where I'm actively hunting for specific types of targets. I know that I'm building a business that needs this kind of technology. I haven't found it, but I'll go describe that to a series of leading VCs and say, I want this. If it comes across your desk, raise your hand. And
so it's kind of they act kind of at your first filter.
And it's good for them because they know what I'm doing and what I'm interested in, and kind of maybe guide some of their investment. But it's good for me because they often do call me and say, hey, these 2 guys out of Stanford invented this neat thing, you should go talk to them. And so that's one method, and that's often one that I use a lot more in the more emerging spaces. Like that's a lot of our discussions this last week were around blockchain, because there's not a lot of large at-scale blockchain entities out there.
Yeah.
And so, but other businesses that we work with, like my FSS business, there's a lot of, there's a whole variety of things. There's small startups, but there are much larger assets in that space. And that's driven a lot more by, we have a large, mature financial services sector of business, and with dedicated sales forces to dedicated clients. And in that case, I'm usually reaching out to those either clients directly or the IBM reps that interact with those clients of what's interesting at Citibank, what's happening, where is Wells Fargo interested in, and they guide me.
So you're asking your customers?
Yeah, we have these direct relationships with many of these key customers in these spaces. We work in healthcare, and so I have a healthcare business, so what is Mayo interested in, what is Cleveland Clinic interested in, what is Memorial Sloan Kettering interested in, and they usually have visibility into the cool, new, interesting company they just did a POC with. And really their feedback, I would say, is the most valuable. I often get asked this question of, how do I get on a big company's radar like IBM, or how do you see me? And my answer is always go do something really cool with one of my customers. If Citibank calls me up and says, I just did this POC with this like AI management tool and I'm starting to roll it out across my loan origination division, you should come see it. I immediately want to talk to that company and understand more about them.
Okay, so yeah, the customers seem to be a really good source.
Yeah, it's the best filter. If somebody's actually using it and deploying it, that means it works. That means you've got some hygiene in your company. That means you know how to deploy it. That means you know how to sell it. That means, it's a whole bunch of things to hit that bar. And so it's an easy, if you can do that, then I'm interested.
And then I guess at IBM, you guys have the ability to scale what's working here to a bunch of similar customers, maybe across categories.
Sometimes that gets into the, okay, now what do we do with something when we acquire it, and how do I value it, and, how do we go forward from there? And there's lots of different ways. And again, the answer is always, you're going to hear this constantly, is it depends. But we work in 200 plus countries, I think, in a lot of different languages and in a lot of different industries. And so when I look at a technology, there's always can I sell it somewhere else? Can I sell it to a different set of customers? Can I sell some of my stuff with it? Can I sell some of their stuff to some of my customers that they're not in? There's all these different synergies that you can put together ultimately for a company.
So actually, this might be actually a good time to talk about valuation. We have a lot of topics to cover, but I think this one is kind of key for people who don't have necessarily a whole lot of experience. The question is there a formula? Is it a DCF? Is it a comparable? Is it public, private thing? How do you evaluate a company, what it's worth to you, or what you're ready to pay for it?
Look at that one, yeah.
For us, it depends on the size, right? So if it's a technology ingredient, it's often just understanding what kind of money been put in and what would make a deal happen, basically.
So that's the
get to the lowest common denominator.
That's the VC valuation formula.
Well, but then
2x VC.
The problem though with VC for us, at least, we actually we prefer to buy companies pre-VC because then they become a little too expensive when it comes to technology. Then you have to have revenue. So I think for technology, at least for the ones that we acquired, it's really it's almost like greenfield approach, right? What it would cost, how long it would take for us to do something on our own versus what
so it's more like build versus buy.
Sort of build versus buy, plus there's probably other factors that go in, like what would make, because you could go above that if the founders aren't willing to sell for a certain amount, right? Then you have to kind of stretch and are willing to pay extra premium because they already have it and we have a risk. So I think for those type of acquisitions, it really becomes more of an art than science, honestly.
It's reassuring to have a formula.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's hard to come with. I know the VC formula. Unfortunately, we can't meet the VC formula most of the times. And then when it comes to companies that actually have revenue and profitability, at that point we look at multiples. I think for us, a lot of it is precedent transactions, our own multiples, our own margins, comparing. And I think in that case, for us at least, it ranges anywhere from 1.5 to 3 times multiple on revenue.
Because you're typically buying companies with products and sales. So
in that scale. And then we've done a lot of analysis on much more scaled businesses. If you go more into large companies, several hundred billion companies, at that point you do more robust valuation where you kind of would do what typically investment bankers do. You go through DCF, comparable multiples, comparable transactions, and that becomes a much more involved exercise.
The VC formula is very simple. Just make
X
the fund.
times, exactly, X times money.
Make the fund.
Make the fund.
3x the fund.
No, we like to catch the company's pre-VC valuations or pre-VC funding.
So
that's
Todd,
the ideal,
what about you? So how does that work? The magic formula at IBM. Tell us some
my
secrets.
standard answer is it depends. The real answer is all of the above, and it really depends on where you're going. Tech acquisitions, I completely agree with you. It's often a build versus buy. There's often a time component to that as well. If I'm trying to catch a market and it's going to take me a year and a half to build something, then I'm willing to pay a premium for the same thing that I could buy it and have it tomorrow. But I often do run kind of the VC formula, and I also run the PE formula of kind of how would they look at something.
Tell us.
I'm often I'm often competing with private equity firms now more and more in some of the purchases.
That's kind of a recent thing, right? More and more.
We've always competed with them to some extent, but they are, my impression is private equity firms are starting to build larger and more complicated and complementary portfolios where they may be doing roll-ups or other things in an industry segment, and they start to see synergies that are looking, the big ones especially, that look a lot like what a strategic would, how we would think about synergies of, can I take this and sell it with that and put it into these different channels and amplify it in the same ways. And so it's interesting, there's a whole other maybe topic on how PE's, the trend that's going there. But I understand their model, and I can run a PE model against a target and understand how they're probably going to bid against me in a given thing. But really what we're talking about is the valuation of an entity, kind of the fair market value of that thing. And if it's a public company, it's some premium over a 52-week high or 52-week average. If it's you can do DCFs, you can do multiples of revenue. It's an advertising company, you may look at the number of eyeballs they have, or if it's like GitHub obviously was partially at least measured on the number of developers on that platform and how often they're interacting with it. So there's all these different ways to establish the fair market value. And you know this from the previous session I did, that the one that is probably more important to me is not what is it worth to the market, it's what is it worth to me. And that's often very different.
And it could be less than the market.
Yeah, if you asked me a question of what would be the multiple, or what would you be willing to pay? Is there any kind of benchmark
range,
1x, or what's the floor? And I could foresee situations where I would not take a business that someone would pay me to take it, a reverse multiple almost, because it just has no benefit to my organization, and I'm not going to be able to grow it, and it's not useful to me, and it's don't sell me a hairdryer company. I just can't, even if it's a great deal, I just can't do anything with it. But likewise, I may be willing to pay an extraordinarily high multiple for a company that is, I can amplify them 100 times or 1,000 times when I put them into my channel. So often I'll get into discussions with somebody of, I want 10, no, I want 11, no, I want 12, no, we want 11, no, we want 10. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to make 1,000 with this guy. This is irrelevant. So it's really, what is it worth? What is it worth to me? And it's an internal case, but that's the one that's the most important.
So that's kind of interesting what you're saying here, because so we're on the sales side, sort of. We have about 800 companies in portfolio. All of them should exit in some way, ideally at some point. So can you help us a little bit negotiate against you? How do we know what's your highest price? How do we, what can a startup do to basically increase the perceived value of what they do that maybe they're not articulating well enough, that they could do better with, or understand when actually your ceiling is a lot higher than what they think?
I always coach the CEOs and the individuals that we're talking to in the target. This is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Is what we're after is honestly is just what could the future business be together, and the 1 + 1 = 3. What is the 3? And I honestly walk in don't knowing that. I have an idea that there's something great we could do together, but I don't really know what that is. And when the CEO on the other side just wants to go immediately have a cutthroat price discussion, that's not really helpful to me. And if I don't get a lot of information from them on what could we do together, and they're focused on, for them in some cases it's an end. It's an end point. It's a transaction.
They see it as an actual exit.
And in some cases, it may be an exit. They're going to get kind of life-changing money, and their plan is, in some cases, they're blunt about it. If my plan is to go to the Bahamas, and that's not the conversation that I want to have. The conversation I want to have is what is, for me, it's a beginning, and what is that beginning, and what is that new thing that we can build together, and the businesses that we think are the most successful and the acquisitions that are most successful are the ones where the discussion I have is really centered around the value that we're going to create together. Now, like I said, that's a double-edged sword, because if we have a really good conversation there, and we're like, wow, we could do this and we could do that, and we could sell to this audience,
really
and develop
understand
this
how much
thing.
value they're going to create.
Exactly. They kind of can turn that around on me a little bit and say, we need to talk a little bit more on money here, because I can see where we're going with this. But it's still, I think it's not a losing situation, because if we really understand that we can create something fantastic together, that also has a psychological impact for many of the individuals who want to stay with the company, because they want to go do that. And they want to fulfill the much larger vision of the company that it's kind of their child often, and they want to see it grow up and be successful. So it's also a little double-sided for them. If we paint that beautiful picture, there's been situations where a company has a choice to exit to this vision that we have painted together in future investment and create this thing, or they have a choice to exit to private equity firm that they know it's going to be a different experience. And monetarily, the private equity firm may be at par or even a little better than what I'm offering them, but they may still choose to come over to my deal because of what the future looks like. So it's triple-edged sword. I don't know. It works. It reveals my hand to them, but it reveals their hand to me, and sometimes they have to make a difficult choice.
How's the experience at Logitech on that?
I was just, when you were asking with the whole synergy point in the channel, I feel like we often get inbounds from companies that assume that they could scale within Logitech. And so, I was just thinking of an example, like if someone came to me and said, oh, look, I'm selling this connected mask online right now, and I'm only selling 1,000 units. Imagine if I can put it in every Best Buy store around the country through Logitech channel, I could have, $50 million business. And then, so we often get this kind of, not quite this good, but those type of ideas where people just assume that they can put out their product into our channel, into our distribution, and they scale, so therefore you should pay me for that. So, and I think sometimes you just want the entrepreneur to Tom's point, to actually just focus on what they believe the user experience is. If they say, well, this connected mask is actually important in a certain vertical, and highlight the value, and then you can kind of you can just help the other side to think, okay, maybe I can think of a couple of markets like that where it makes sense, and really develop and what is your true value proposition is, versus just kind of, jump into, you kind of try to leapfrog multiple steps and go into, I can distribute it worldwide, at least for us, because, this is kind of, that's what our business is, right, the mass market retail, but I think that's where sometimes you don't necessarily get the collaborative discussion when people set this expectation. So yeah.
Okay. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'll just fire a couple of quick questions and I'll turn to the audience for their questions. So one question